morning, everyone. Welcome to this Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project webinar. My name is Kirsten Bayer, and I'm with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. This project is funded by ISB, or the Illinois State Board of Education. So we are excited to bring you this webinar this morning. We do monthly webinars on the second Tuesday of every month. And today's webinar is titled Transition to College, Preparing Students with Autism to Navigate the Post-Secondary Terrain. And we are joined by our presenter today, Susan Woods, and I'll let her introduce herself here in a minute when I'm done with my housekeeping. So again, like I said, my name is Kirsten Bayer. I am the Assistant Director of Communications here at ICSPS. Here's my email and phone number if you would like to reach out to me. I'm joined by my colleague, Brittany Boston, who is our Associate Director, and she will be helping support and facilitate today's webinar with me. So feel free to reach out to either one of us via the chat if you would like to. Let me make sure everyone can chat because sometimes my Zoom is weird. But yeah, so everyone can use the chat now. So you can feel free to say good morning and reach out to either one of us if you need anything or any support during today's webinar. A little bit about the ADA project if you're not familiar with us or you're new to the system and new to joining our PD sessions. The ADA project develops and presents resources that assist individuals with autism or autistic individuals. I'm going to use both of those terms interchangeably today. I know it depends what your preference is. And so we have individuals with autism or autistic individuals, so I'll use those interchangeably. But we support those individuals with autism in their transition. So specifically focusing on the transition piece from secondary education to post-secondary or from secondary education to employment, because we all know that individuals with autism have a ton of support in the secondary system, but not as much support when they go into the employment or into the post-secondary system. So we focus on that transitional piece and helping parents and educators and employers and community-based organizations really support the individuals with autism. And then a little bit about our center. If you're not familiar with us, you can check us out on our website, and Brittany can put that in the chat for you. And our center houses the ADA project. We are in the College of Education in the Educational Administration and Foundations Department at Illinois State University. We have been around since 1977, so quite some time. And our mission is to support the successes of every learner through application research-based practices. We encourage professionals to educate equitably, and we offer expertise in creating excellent learning environments. Most of our work that we do is professional development webinars and events. We do multiple events throughout the year, as well as webinars and resources that we are continuously researching and providing. And we do a ton of technical assistance and program improvement strategies for the Illinois State Board of Education, for the Illinois Community College Board, and focusing on career and technical and adult education and workforce professionals. Here's our website, which Brittany already put in the chat for you all. So you can check us out there. We have multiple webinars, multiple webinars ever since we've been doing the ADA project. And you can view all of them there along with this one as well. And then we have a couple of polls that we're going to do for housekeeping. A couple of other housekeeping items that you'll notice as an attendee is that we are on Zoom webinar. So for Zoom webinar, it's similar to Zoom meeting, but it's a little bit different. So as an attendee, you cannot unmute yourself or turn on your microphone. So we ask that you do fully immerse yourself and participate in today's session by participating in the chat or the Q&A. And Brittany and myself will monitor that and help Susan facilitate that. We're going to hold all questions to the end, but please feel free to type it in the chat throughout the session so you don't forget. And then we will also have Susan's slides available to you. I will post those in the chat momentarily, and we will have them on the website along with the recording within about 48 business hours. You'll also receive a follow-up email tomorrow from Zoom, and it will have in there the link to our website, which will have the presentation and recording up on it. And then it will also have a follow-up survey, and we do encourage your participation in that follow-up survey. I know follow-up surveys can be kind of tedious, but we do look at them. We have an ADA professional development committee where we bring in other community members, parents, and other people in our community to help generate this professional development and really determine what the system needs. And there is a question on the survey where you can voice your own opinion on any topics or presenters or anything that you think the system needs as well. And we would love to explore those for you so we can bring that professional development and really meet the system where they are at or where you all are at. So I'm going to start our polls here. I'm going to launch them now. So the first one is, which region are you located in? And then the second one is, which ATA stakeholder are you? And for the ATA stakeholder one, you should be able to select multiple of them. So if you are a secondary educator, but you also are a family member, or you also consider yourself a community member, feel free to select both of those. And I'm going to stop sharing, and Susan, you can pull up your slides whenever you're ready. You should be able to just move that poll quiz window to the side. But we'll keep the polls up and let everyone keep answering them, and you should be able to scroll and answer both of those for us. So we'll give every couple more seconds to answer the polls. And Susan, did you need help?
Hold on.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
Take your time.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're fine. Take your time. People are still answering the polls here.
Okay. I needed to go to there and to there and to there. And Kirsten, can you see it?
Yes, I can. That looks great.
Perfect.
So we're still doing the polls. So give me one more second. So I'm going to end the polls and share the results just so we can all see who's joining us today. So it looks like a lot of people are from up north in Illinois, Chicago, Northeast, Northwest. We have a couple Southerners with us, Southern Illinoisans with us. So welcome. We like to see a good span across the state, which looks great. And then we also have quite a few secondary and post-secondary educators, which is to be expected with this topic today, which is awesome. And quite a few community members, couple family members, etc. So that's great. Thank you all for taking those polls. One more housekeeping thing I want to know is that we do have closed captioning on for accessibility reasons or for note-taking purposes. So feel free to put that or turn that on your Zoom toolbar. And I think that's all my housekeeping items. So I'll hand it off to you, Susan, to start your presentation. And Brittany and I will be here for support.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Kirsten and Brittany. And can everybody hear me okay? I just want to, if you can't, type it into the chat, but I think the audio is pretty good. My name is Susan Woods, and I'm coming to you from snowy Sunapee, New Hampshire. So first, sort of disclaimer caveat, I'm not from Illinois. I know people in Illinois. I don't know a lot about Illinois specifically. So this is going to be some somewhat generalized information. And then I can talk about some resources and things that you might refer to. But I'm in Sunapee, New Hampshire now. And a little bit about my background, who I am, how the ATA project sort of stumbled upon me. I've worked in the community college system in Massachusetts for over 30 years. My educational background was way back, I'm going to age myself, in the 70s, with a bachelor's degree in special education and a master's degree in rehabilitation. In the early 80s, I was fortunate to be part of sort of some groundbreaking initiatives in Massachusetts that involved closing down institutions that were serving people with developmental disabilities or not serving people. And I worked for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Developmental Services. And I was in charge of what was referred to as the Turning 22 initiative, which came back to me later. And then in the late 80s, I joined the community college system, and I was there until I retired. I was 27 years. And my title was the Associate Dean of Student Support Services. And what that involved was I oversaw the services for students with documented disabilities. And it was a 10,000 student body community college. And we had about 1,000 students who had identified as individuals with disabilities. I also managed several new programs, launched a program specialized for individuals with autism that were still in high school, a transition program, And then I was also part of the Dean of Students team and did a lot of work with counseling, advising, and student assessment and intervention. I was lucky because I worked for a state pension system that I was able to retire at a fairly young age. And simultaneously, I've been teaching as an adjunct professor at several colleges in Massachusetts. And the focus of my teaching has been on developmental disabilities, but I also taught at the community college courses called First Year Experience and Psychology of Success. Again, I retired in 2017, and at that time, I launched a professional development practice, which is how the ADA team discovered me. My focus in this practice has been providing professional development and training to college faculty and staff to promote the use of teaching strategies and approaches that use principles of universal design. I also have been, for the past 7 years, providing workshops in high schools, in human service agencies, to transition specialists, guidance staff, special ed staff, with this focus, transition to college. And then I've also been teaching courses to high school staff as part of their certification on autism, on effective strategies for students with disabilities. And then, just so I don't sit around and watch daytime TV, I'm also involved in 4 nonprofit boards. One of them is called Stairway to STEM, and I'll be referring to that later on with a wonderful resource to share with you. And then I'm also on 3 boards in 2 boards in New Hampshire and 1 in Massachusetts, focused on serving individuals with mental health and developmental disabilities. So that's what I do to keep myself busy and out of trouble. Let's see why I'm not progressing here. There we go. So what I'm going to be talking about, what this workshop is all about. In the write-up, what they did was take sort of my verbiage, and that is basically, as students have received services on IEPs and 504 plans, I found, and I'm passionate about this, there's a very, very, very large need for clarity and information. My focus here, my whole reason for doing this, is to try to dispel some of the misconceptions. There are a lot of them out there. Sending children, adolescents, offspring, students to college is anxiety provoking as it is. Then you have the overlay of a student with some challenges. So what my hope is, my goal is that you'll gain an understanding of the difference between services and accommodations for students in the K through 12 system, and how to prepare their students or their children for success. And that's sort of the overarching goal. And these are the outcomes that I hope we'll achieve. You'll get a little bit of information and understanding. I'm not an attorney, but we have to talk about laws. That's part of the rationale. That's part of what informs all of this. We're going to talk a little bit about the whole notion of reasonable accommodations. And what does that mean in the post-secondary environment? And then we're going to talk about some unique characteristics, particularly, obviously, this is a focus on individuals on the autism spectrum. And as Kirsten said, you'll find that I will toggle back and forth with identity language, as in individuals with autism or autistic individuals. And then finally, and this is, I think, the real important piece, the meat, is what can we do to help? What can we, whether we're professionals, parents, educators, and support people, what are the skills that a student needs to be successful, and how do we help that and foster that? So hopefully this is what you've signed on for, and hopefully that this will provide you with some resources. So first and foremost, I said there's laws. I'm not going to open up these links. One of the reasons I asked for the whole presentation to be shared is that so you have some time to play around with some of the live links here. But the 2 laws essentially that govern what happens in a post-secondary environment. And when I say post-secondary, I will qualify. That's colleges, that's universities, that's community colleges, that's public, that's private. So we may be talking about a community college, we may be talking about Ohio State, we may be talking about Harvard. These laws cover the gamut of post-secondary. The only exception, and it's a very small exception, of institutions that may not be required to comply with these laws would be a small, I'd say less than 5, handful of religious post-secondary institutions that do not receive any financial aid or any federal support. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But this is the world. The world is post-secondary education. And again, college and university will be used interchangeably. You've probably heard the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was reauthorized under the Bush administration. And this is a very, very broad, far-reaching piece of legislation that basically protects individuals with disabilities in employment, public services, and public accommodations, housing, and buildings. The other law, and this is where there's a lot of confusion, and we're gonna sort of tease this out a little bit, is Section 504 and 508 of the Rehab Act. And again, in your free time, if you like reading legislation, go at it. But this law focuses on prohibiting discrimination against an otherwise qualified individual solely based on the disability in any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance, hence the financial aid connection. Most college universities, with the exception of a very small number of religious institutions, have financial aid available to their students. If that's the case, then they are obligated to follow these 2 laws. And then the last link there, and let me just back up. The eligibility, it's very broad. I'm going to dig into this a little bit more in a later slide. But the disability, and we're referring to everything as disability, which is nomenclature that not everybody's comfortable with, but we have to sort of reflect that back on the law. The disability has a current impact on a major life activity. So when you read the ADA language, that includes in the reauthorization, learning and thinking. So you can imagine how broadly that can be interpreted. Last link I have there is a source link. And this sort of brings you back to those laws and compliance in higher ed. Again, just a resource. So, whoops, there we go. So again, this is what the ADA says, the ADAA, which is the reauthorized. You can read this on your own. It's not magical license language, but the takeaway from this is how broadly this can be defined. When you think about major life activities, when you think about concentrating, thinking, communicating. A lot of people think disability and they think, oh, that's mobility, that's sensory. But we know, since we're all in the autism community, that also includes communication. That also includes concentrating. So it's a very, very broad definition, and it protects a lot of people. And it's considered a class protection. And again, another caveat. You're going to hear the term disability, and I've worked with many, many students over my 30 years in a community college, and as both a faculty and as an administrator. A lot of students and families are not comfortable with that word. And what I've seen over my years, many offices will change their name, and they'll be called the Accommodation Center or the Learning Accommodation Center or the Access Department. As you surf around on different college and university websites, you'll see different names. The bottom line, however, and I, as an administrator, they've since changed it since I retired, but I kept the word disability in the description of the office, mainly because it's most Googleable. It's easiest to find. Sometimes if you're surfing around different sites, you may get sort of into a rabbit hole and get lost. So I found that it was a good, very transparent way of communicating. Others disagree with me, which is fine. So what did I see? Well, again, 27 years an administrator, 1,000 students per year. This is what I saw. No surprise here. Certainly over the years, there were certain upticks in certain groups that of students I met, specifically autism spectrum disorders and psychiatric or mental health disorders were the largest upticks. There's always going to be students with learning disabilities, and that includes nonverbal learning disabilities. There's some overlap there with the autism community. Always going to be students on attention deficit disorder, ADD, ADHD. Again, I hate the term comorbidity, but there is some with our individuals on the spectrum, certainly psychiatric disabilities. And then sort of on the lower tier were the physical mobility disabilities, sensory disabilities, neurological disabilities, various syndromes, low incidence syndromes, as well as some chronic diseases. Again, overlap is fine. And we get to the conversation about what a student needs to do. This is where the student is responsible for letting the individual, the disability office know what it is they want accommodations for. So this is not really an exhaustive list. This is what I saw in my experience. And again, the legal obligations, what the college must do or may not do. I know I'm going to get a question later on, and I'm going to cut it off at the pass right now. And that is, can my son or daughter or can my student be discriminated against based on their disability? Well, point number one, no. Keep in mind, otherwise qualified. So the legal obligations of the college is they can't discriminate based on the disability. You can't, if a student in their essay says, I'm on the autism spectrum or I'm blind, that cannot be the reason that their application goes into the no pile. The college university has to provide equal access for all qualified applicants. And they have to provide auxiliary aids and services. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. In my time as an administrator, the buck stopped sort of with me, ultimately with the president of the institution. But if the institution was not following these laws, a student, with the help of their family, had a right to appeal. There was various appeal processes, but ultimately they could bring their complaint to the Office of Civil Rights. So the underlying sort of piece here is that this is covered under the Office of Civil Rights. And there's a great website that I've linked here for students with disabilities that covers a lot of that. Short little anecdote. I happen to be a alum of Boston University, and there was a famous case, a Guckenberg versus Boston University case, back in the 70s, I think, or early 80s. You can check it out. But the institution said, and under their provost and their president said, yeah, we don't really believe this whole learning disability thing. Guckenberger was a student who was asking for an accommodation to waive a foreign language requirement, which in some instances is a reasonable accommodation in college. She was denied. She went through the process, and ultimately she, and probably with her family, sued Boston University and won. So basically they were discounting and ignoring their obligation to not discriminate against a person with disability. It's wonderful reading if you want to check it out. So a couple slides that are just going to sort of delineate, and again, this is sort of our intro here, what the differences are. Many of you know this, some of you may not. I won't spend a lot of time on the slides, but I think it's important to take a look side by side. What happens in high school? What happens in college? I can't tell you how many questions I've gotten from parents specifically is, does the IEP follow my son or daughter for the rest of their life? I think most of us might know the answer to that. The IEP ends. The IEP ends when the student leaves high school, whether by graduating, by dropping out, or with a certificate of completion. So the side-by-side in high school, the law that governs what happens for an individual who identifies as having a disability, which inclusive of autism spectrum, would be the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. In college, it's ADAA and 504 and 508 of the Rehab Act. A quick note, this is one of the most confusing pieces of this. Many people, individuals will say, well, I'm on a 504 plan in high school. Can't that carry over to college? And the answer is the 504 plan in high school is a high school plan. It doesn't carry over. The law is the same law. The plan may look similar, but the actual document that's referred to as a 504 plan also ends once a student leaves high school. I hope that clarifies a little bit. Again, the side-by-side. In high school, there may be modifications. In college, there's not going to be. We're going to tease this out in a few slides about what we're talking about. Big difference. And you'll hear me say this once, you'll hear me say it 10 times. The school district's responsible in high school. In college or in universities, the student's responsible. And that in itself causes a lot of people anxiety. We're going to go into that too. Personal services may be provided in high school, OT, an aid. Those services are not required. And again, the school district is responsible in high school, the student's responsible in college. This also plays out in terms of advocacy. So what do we see here? It's pretty straightforward, but the students are supported by an IEP team. There's usually a liaison in high school. One of the differences is there is no liaison per se. In college, there is an office that may provide some of that advocacy, but they're not necessarily assigned to a special ed liaison. We also don't use the term special education. That ends. In high school, the school does everything. In college, the student is driving the bus. You'll hear me say that a few times. One of the big sources of concern, anxiety, stress among families is what they're entitled to have access to. And if you've never heard of a law referred to as FERPA, Family Educational Rights Act, basically, families can have access to records. So there can be a FERPA release a student can sign that will give the family member an access to records. When we're saying records, what that typically means is grades, okay? I had a son at a major university in Boston. He was struggling a little bit. I could not contact the school and say, so what did Josh get on his final exam in calculus? But what I did have access to, because I demanded it of my son, was I got access to his grades when they were published. But I did not have access to the professor. I didn't have access to various personnel at the school. So that's a big difference there. And again, the other big difference is, and I've said it before, the student is in charge. When you encounter disability staff at a college or university, they may be advocating, but they're not necessarily a case manager. We'll talk about some colleges at the end that have some specialized programs where you may get those services. They're typically fee-based, so we'll hold that for now. But again, bottom line, students in charge. This is a new notion for a lot of kids. This next slide is basically a very generic slide, and it's logistical differences. And quite frankly, now this is a rule of thumb. It does not necessarily apply to every student, every college, any university. However, I've been a faculty, and I can tell students that there is going to be a major difference. And these are whether the students have a disability or not. And that is for example, how much time a student is devoting to work. There was a rule of thumb that it's basically for every hour of class, it's about 3 hours outside. Now, obviously, that depends on the course and the design of the course. But this is sort of a straightforward side by side, some of the basic differences between college and high school. One of the pieces I want to just tease out of this for a second is the notion, and again, many of us who remember college or are familiar with college environments know that there's a syllabus. And each college, each faculty, each instructor distributes that at the start of the semester. One of the hard things for many students, whether they're students on the autism spectrum or students with other challenges or students first time, maybe first in their family to go to college, is that this is almost, for lack of a better term, a contract between the student and the faculty. And each faculty creates their own within reason. There may be some oversight from the institution, but it's their rules. So, for example, Professor Jones may have a very, very strict attendance requirement. Professor Smith may say, yeah, show up when you want, take the test, write the papers, whatever. That's going to vary from teacher to teacher. Whereas in high school, everybody's used to sort of the same rules. So that's a takeaway that sometimes students are not expecting, that there's going to be variation. There's something called academic freedom, and the faculty can run things sort of the way they want. So that's just a side note. So this is just a quick summary. Special ed model, accommodations model. School finds you, student has to ask for it. So that goes down. We're going to dig into sort of how a student does that. How do they identify and say, I am a student with a disability or with something that meets the definition of being qualified for accommodations. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Again, side by side, level of responsibility. I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about what do we need, what skills should a student have if they're contemplating college. But student needs to, and this hopefully is being grown, it's being developed while they're in high school, is an understanding of themselves, an understanding of what they need and what to ask for and how to manage some of the challenges. So that's a quick takeaway on that. Okay, so I'm gonna use Brittany as my student. Brittany, if that's okay with you. Brittany's deciding to come to college. Brittany has a history of receiving services on an individual ed plan. Brittany may have a documented diagnosis of autism spectrum with a little bit of ADHD, and how about let's throw in some anxiety and depression. That's a trifecta. This may be what she is presenting. This is her experience. So Brittany arrives, she's been accepted to the college or university. A footnote. This process starts once the student is going. It doesn't start when they're shopping. So that's one big distinction to make. Again, my vantage point, and I'll be very clear, has been community college. I have not worked at a major university with, selective admissions requirements, but I talk to a lot of those people. I'm on a lot of listserv. But pretty much, and I'm sure the community colleges in Illinois are maybe similar in that they have an open admission process for high school graduates. But once Brittany, and she's my student, has decided and been accepted to the college university, that is her time to say, raise her hand. I am a student that has identified as having a disability, and I'm going to provide you with documentation. So the caveat here, the footnote, this does not go to the admissions office. They're not entitled to this information. They don't know what to do with this information, and you don't want them to have this information. Again, they're admitting Brittany based on her qualification. She's otherwise qualified. They know nothing about her disability. So she's in. She then says, okay, this is who I am. And most colleges, I'd say every college on their website has a form It's usually now you can fill them out online, and it's the student's declaration or declaring, this is me, I'm coming to your institution in the fall, and this is what I've got. And then the student sends in documentation. We're going to dig into what that is. And I hope that this is information that most of you might know. The student is going to be providing the testing, evaluations, assessments that got the student the IEP or 504 plan in high school. So it's not just the IEP. Can't tell you how many times I would have, and I'm making a generalization there, a young man with his mom walk into my office clutching his IEP and saying, I'm here, here's my IEP. And I have to say, okay, thank you for that, but we need to have the documentation that got you the IEP. And so when that happens, and the timing of it varies, it depends on when the student is going to college. But let's say in a ballpark, we're talking about Brittany. She's deciding to go to college next fall 2024. This process is starting usually around April, May of this year, where she's made her decision, she's declaring and sending the documentation. The office, whatever that office is called, again, disability services, accommodation center, access center, whatever they call it, then has a chance to take a look at it and they review it. The good news is the staff that are doing that are trained to review it. So they know how to read a neuropsych report. They know how to look at learning disability testing and see the discrepancies. They know how to read the notes from the treating psychiatrist. And they're taking some notes, and they may be looking at the IEP or the 504 plan. Then what happens, and again, in the post-COVID world, this could be a Zoom call. The good old days, it was a face-to-face meeting. The student came in, met with a person, and then started the interactive process. And when I say interactive process, the student's at the center of this. So they're talking about, okay, this is what happens to me when I'm trying to listen and take notes. Or this is what happens during a test when somebody stands up and everything flies out of my head. So hopefully we've gotten to the point where the student has some self-awareness and some idea of why they were on an IEP and what the IEP did for them and what they're requesting in college and why. This is crucial. Again, sometimes I've met with students and I say, why are you here? And they say, because my mother told me to come. And then I say, why were you on IEP? And they say, I don't know. That can be a problem. So let's assume Brittany is pretty self-aware. She knows a little bit about what her challenges were and what sort of accommodations she is requesting. Hopefully the staff in the office and Brittany are then developing the accommodations plan. It's a plan. It may be developed as a letter. It may be developed as a form. There's some variation there. But again, Brittany is at the center of this process, and she is driving the bus. Okay, so once that's developed and Brittany is now a student at this institution, it will be Brittany's responsibility to then take this accommodation plan the next step. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's back up to documentation. This is sort of boilerplate. There's some variation, and that's just the takeaway here is that each college or university does develop their own rules within the construct of the laws. The good news is there's a couple great professional organizations out there that most colleges and universities are involved with, subscribe to. One is called AHEAD, AHEAD. I think I have a link in the resource page at the end. It stands for the Association of Higher Ed Disability. And the other is the abbreviation is DSSHE, DISHE, and that's Disabled Student Services in Higher Education. It's managed through University of Buffalo. Both of those are great organizations that as an administrator and my staff, we would go and check in on what's going on. There's some best practices. Again, each college and university structures their own rules, but they're in the confines of complying with the law. What I used to say to my provost and the president of the college is, my job was to keep the college out of court. So I want to make sure that we're following the law within our own policies. So again, there's going to be some variation in some of these rules, but most of it is pretty standard. The question I'm always asked, and the answer is very simple. It depends. The question I'm asked is, how old can the documentation be? Rule of thumb usually was no more than 3 years old. But honestly, there's some sort of exceptions to that. When I say no more than 3 years old, it's not the testing that was done when the son or daughter or the student was in 8th grade. An 8th grader and a junior in high school are two very different people. So what the college is looking for, what they're trying to glean from this is what's happening, how does the disability impact this individual in a learning environment, and what should the accommodations, the reasonable accommodations be? The exceptions to that may be in psychiatric. If a student has a primary psychiatric disability or a secondary disability, it's a psychiatric disorder, like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, others, most likely the institution is going to want a current status because there's a lot of change, a lot of variation in psychiatric disabilities. The other exception, and I doubt that this will be your population or would be an older student that may not have been, they may be in their 30s when they decide to go to school. Their testing may have been from high school. That would qualify. But again, these are the documents. It's what was done to get the student the IEP. It has to be relevant. It has to have a very specific diagnostic statement. In most cases, our students on the autism spectrum have a neuropsych evaluation. That would be the documentation. And then if there's other challenges like ADD or depression, there might be other additional documentation. Again, sort of a repeat. I did have a case one time of a student whose mother was a psychologist and submitted her testing. That didn't go over well. It should be from somebody who is impartial. And again, sometimes summary of performance will accompany the IEP. That's all good information. Let me back up for a second. Because, again, this is not a hoop that the office is trying to make the student and family jump through. It's to get an idea what's going on. How does this condition or this disability or this challenge impact the individual in a learning environment? What's going on now? So once you've gone through the documentation process, Brittany's in the office or on a Zoom meeting with the staff in the accommodations disability office, and they're developing a plan. And what is that plan ultimately going to look like? Well, ultimately, it's probably going to have some typical accommodations on them. It's probably going to have extended time for tests and exam. It's probably going to have, again, given what Brittany has shared with us, distraction reduced area for testing, and not distraction free necessarily, distraction reduced. It may include note takers, somebody in her class that takes notes. They don't know who the notes are for. It may include preferential seating. It may include access to some assistive technologies. The nice thing is that also some colleges provide some additional support. And if you find that, I do have a listing at the end of colleges that have some fee-based support. It may be a good idea to take a longer, deeper look at that. They may include tutoring strategies, metacognitive approaches to learning, help with study skills, test-taking strategies, course selection advocacy. Important note, these are not accommodations. They're not required. So that's the most important takeaway there. Again, that interactive process, we want to hear from Brittany. So I had a student walk in and say, I always record my lectures. I said, that's great. What do you do with them? Nothing. I can't learn that way. So one of the things that's really important, and we're going to talk about self-awareness, the more Brittany, and again, Brittany's my student, knows about what works for her and what doesn't, and is able to articulate it, and that's where that self-advocacy comes. Here's what I need, and my documentation supports that. So I hope this is somewhat useful. Okay, now here's where the reality. I very glibly say we're not in Kansas anymore. So here's what likely is not an accommodation. And again, college universities have their own policies, but my experience has been these are likely not going to be an accommodation. Changes or modifications of course content. Brittany is in chemistry. Chemistry teacher says, oh, Brittany, no, you only have to do questions 1, 3, 5, and 9. Everybody else is doing 1 through 10. That's not going to happen. Adjustment of academic expectations. Can't tell you how many students said to me, I'm ready, I'm going, I'm very excited, except I don't do math. I said, well, yeah, okay. Well, math is a requirement for even an associate's degree. What's your major? They say engineering. That's going to be a problem. So there's not going to be across the board waivers. There's not going to be cross the board assignment deadline changes or alternative assignments. Now, many people say, but what about because of my processing speed, because of my executive functioning challenges, it takes me longer to do the work. That's legitimate. However, and this is debated fiercely across the country, usually you're not going to find across the board, okay, the assignment's due on Monday, except for Brittany, it's due in a week from Monday. There will be cases, there will be exceptions to this. And they're usually case by case, and they're usually negotiated, but they're usually not cross the board extensions. And the thing to note on that is there's also a good reason for that not to work. Most colleges, unless they're modified accelerated sessions, most colleges work on a 15-week semester. Well, if Brittany was given extensions, all of a sudden it's week 14, and she's got to get everything in. Otherwise, either not pass or get an incomplete. So again, this is hotly debated. There's a resource down there on the bottom of this slide, which is from a group that I'm going to talk about, the LD Advisory, about extensions. It's not across the board, but I would not expect it. Same thing with course or assignment waivers. That student at BU that ended up suing was asking for a foreign language waiver. That's a legitimate course waiver for students with certain processing delays. But she's probably not going to get a complete waiver. She's going to get a substitution. And finally, and this is it's tricky, this is a slippery slope, is the adjustment of behavioral expectations. Those of us that remember college or have sent kids to college or know college know that there's a code of conduct. There's usually a handbook. Again, my experience, sometimes some of the students that I was supporting might have had some difficulties with adherence to that code of conduct. Not necessarily deliberately, but sometimes as a sort of outcome of the way they processed information. I was on what was called a student assessment intervention team. Sometimes we talked about, and oftentimes, and I'll be quite honest with you, they might have been students on the spectrum. They might have been students with psychiatric disabilities. Somebody that interpreted something that they did. We were in a position which I really valued to be able to intervene with the student. But I'll give you one very clear example. I had a student that really loved taking pictures and started taking pictures of female classmates. That made some of the classmates uncomfortable. I don't think it was malicious, but it became interpreted as sort of a little bit of a violation. So we had to address that. So I'm just going to move on from that. It's a lengthier conversation. Accommodations generally don't lower academic standards. They don't water down curricula. They don't substantially change anything. Again, the law is access. Everything in the law points to access. Yes, we want success, but the law does not sort of open it up as a requirement. The student can't consume extra personal time. But this is where I always say, use those support services. Sometimes there's something called TRIO, which is a federally funded support program. There's academic support. There may be counseling. There may be success coaches. Use the resources. Okay, I'm watching the clock. We're getting a little bit slow here. So I'm going to whip to now what do we do? What's your job? Whether you're a high school staff, whether you're a parent, whether you're a support in some support network, what do we do? Well, pretty much working with the student, helping them to understand, helping them to be able to articulate and understand what's going on and how it impacts them, and what works and what doesn't work. That's really the important. I talk about metacognition because that's basically a nice word that refers to thinking about thinking and knowing how you learn. So what do we do? Well, students coming from high school, as much as the high school can do this, and I understand the challenges, and I've worked with a lot of high schools where they're under such time constraints. Some states have tests. In Massachusetts, we had a competency test. They were having to make sure that students met the competencies. So there was not necessarily the time in a day to work with a student on these things. But if you can, it's important. And I think the important pieces are helping a student with their independence, helping them understand, helping them discuss readiness. Rule of thumb, one of my colleagues, Eric Enlick, talks about is the difference between college capable and college ready. Many students are college capable. They can handle the academic rigors. Can they handle the independence? We're going to dip into that a little bit more. Do they have the emotional readiness? So again, self-awareness. As much as possible, and this can be scripted, it can be practiced. Know your strengths. Know when to ask for help. Know what works for you. Are you a morning person? Are you a evening person? Know how to deal with conflict. Now, one of the disclaimers I should have said at the beginning is that I worked in the institution. There was no residential services. There was no housing. I've worked with a lot of colleges, and I've done some of my homework on this, and I have a whole slide on that. But sometimes if a student lives away and is living in a residential dormitory, it's not always sunshine. Sometimes you have to deal with people that you don't like, or people that annoy you, or people whose habits annoy you. There's also a lot of disappointment. Sometimes you get feedback. It's not always easy for a student to get feedback. Sometimes our students on the spectrum, that's a particular area where they might have some difficulty. Again, healthy relationships for certain, and identifying when you might need medical help. Medication is a real important piece of this. A few things that they should consider. Why do I want to go to college? It's just my parents want me to go to college. Do I really want to go to college? How do I function? What's my stamina like? And what else do I need? What environments will work best? Urban, suburban, noisy, quiet. All of those things, as much as possible, should be, at least talked about. How to self-manage. Are students waking themselves up? Are they taking their medication? Are they managing their time? Again, not to profile, but gaming is sometimes the downfall of many of my students that are on the autism spectrum, because all of a sudden, nobody is telling them they have to be somewhere. So that's a real important piece. And then lastly, self-advocacy. Speaking up for yourself. This is working. This is not working. A faculty will not uniformly, hopefully, deny an accommodation. But should that happen, the student goes directly to that accommodations office and says, Professor Smith is not giving me my notes or not doing what my accommodation paper says. Then it's a three-way conversation. The disability office will be intervening. I promise you. Again, if a student is attending their IEP meetings in high school, then they're more likely to have a good understanding of what they need and why. And then having a go-to person, whether it's a therapist, a coach, a counselor, a trusted friend, that seems to be a really, really positive thing. Little chart about self-advocacy, not magic here, but just, knowing what your rights are and knowing how to get them and knowing how to get them in an adult way. I used to work with students on writing an email. That's a skill. And that's an important skill. Sometimes students benefit from assistive technology. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but what I'm going to say is that if that's something that a student is used to or you think would benefit from, there's a nice handy little chart here. And one of my local colleges here has a wonderful YouTube about some of the technologies. For example, a pen, a smart pen that records and takes notes. It's a great invention, and it could be an accommodation that would help the student. So I'm not sure how many parents are in the room, but, and this is just a graphic about what to stop doing. Again, I'm a parent. I put a couple kids through college. I didn't always follow these rules, but it's important as much as possible to get the student to start doing some things on their own. Questions from parents? We've pretty much answered these. I don't think you can count on getting financial assistance because of a disability, but sometimes voc rehab will support students in public institutions. I said before, the college application, again, is disability blind. No play on words there, but they cannot disqualify a student based on a disability. Question often asked is about whether to disclose or not. And this is a very, very personal question, and it varies a lot. My rule of thumb, if a student is applying to a selective college, they're on the autism spectrum, and they want to disclose that in a way that tells about themselves, go at it. But know that they are disclosing to an admissions person who really has no right. On the other hand, if it tells their story, if it tells a little bit about their learning history and what challenges they may have overcome, it might be a worthy essay. There's not going to be in-class assistance. There may be outside coaching at some schools. This slide is basically questions that a parent and a student could ask. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I want to dip into the autism. Some more questions, again, reasonable to ask. Now, what's maybe unique about our students on the autism spectrum? And I'm mindful of our time. These are some things that might happen. Again, I'm never going to make a statement that this will happen, that a student has difficulty with change, that may be overwhelmed, that has challenging social communication. But my experience was this could. Special interests and maybe the focus of the conversation always circling back to that special interest. Certainly, I've seen a lot of students with some sensory sensitivity and some abstract language difficulties. I was fortunate to be able to do a lot of training with college faculty, specifically about supporting students on the autism spectrum. And we talked about the environment and things that the professor could do. Certainly, I could do a whole nother section on universal design, but certainly subscribing and practicing methods that subscribe to universal design is one way to make the course accessible to all. Great book out there. It's in my resource list at the end. This is from Lorraine Wolfe and Jane Theophile Brown. They have a book specifically. The title of the book is The Parent's Guide to College for Students on the Autism Spectrum and Students with Asperger's Syndrome. And it's there's a guide for college personnel. There's a lot of takeaways from their book. These are some of the big ones. Be realistic. Look at the current accommodations and support. If it's appropriate, start paring them down if you know that they're not going to be provided in college. Familiarize yourself with the rules, the code of conduct, start increasing the level of responsibility, develop and access stress management support, and evaluate the college course choices based on the academics, based on the student. That's not always easy. 17-year-olds don't always know what they want. Again, I worked in a community college system. This may be a good starting point for some. I've talked to the staff and the ADA about this. There may be an opportunity for a more scaffolded experience where they're living at home, it can be a reduced course load. It may be a smaller, more supportive learning environment. I don't know every community college in the nation, but there are certain characteristics that you might find in a community college. They may have more robust support, and the professors, for the most part, are not necessarily there to publish or do research. They're there to teach, which may be an advantage, and then a springboard to a university. Since most community colleges have direct access to universities, they also may have dual enrollment opportunities. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to just say that there are residential life questions. Accommodations are handled very differently around residential life. There has to be a pretty compelling reason for an accommodation of a private room to be granted. Again, there's variations here. And there's variations from institution to institution. But this is just sort of a rule of thumb around residential life. It's not my experience, but I have a lot of colleagues that gave me this information. Again, more questions I've gotten from parents, and Brittany, I'm mindful of our time. A couple more slides. Reduced course load can be a wonderful accommodation to request. Again, small bites, scaffolding the experience, working up to a full course load. Again, we're in a post-COVID world, online versus remote. I've taught online, I've taught face-to-face. It varies. Some students do very, very well online, some do miserably. More they know about themselves and how they structure their time. Online is not less than, and sometimes can be more than. So that's a thing to keep in mind. And then, the student loan process, there's going to be some variation from state to state with that. Quick quiz. I'm not going to grade you. Myth number 1, students should be moved from an IEP to a 504 plan because 504 plans are more valid. Well, I'm going to give you the answer. Again, 504 is law. It's not the plan. So a high school 504 plan does not follow. Colleges are subject to subpart E of the federal statute 504, but the plans themselves, they may look similar, but they don't come with you. High school students should be taken off an IEP 504 plan in their senior year because accommodations for learning, attentional, and neurological disabilities and challenges will not occur. Again, not right. It's a myth. If the student needs the plan, stay on the plan, be prepared for some variation, and be prepared for the college to take a look at the IEP as well as the documentation. If a student received accommodations in high school, the college or university must provide the same accommodations? Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. If they were receiving a modified curriculum, I wouldn't expect that to happen. But some of the accommodations, like test taking and note taking, may be the same. High school should add lots of accommodations to the student high school plan so they can receive these in college. Yeah, you can't game the system that way. It doesn't really work. Again, the college is looking at the source documents and the conversation with the student. A very important piece of that. And students will, this is another misconception, students will receive more or better accommodations if they attend a private college. Yeah, that's not the case. In fact, again, I'm going to point to some colleges and universities that have specialized support programs in my resource list. This shouldn't be the case. So, where do we go from here? We're about an hour and 5 minutes in. I want to give time to respond to some of the questions in the chat, but this is a quick summary. Help your student, son or daughter, to understand their strengths, their challenges. This sounds sort of glib, but it really is important. Anticipate expectations. As much as you can, be a good shopper. Go on the website, take a look. Do you get a feeling? I did a podcast, which is on my links, about how colleges and universities can be autism friendly. You know, do they understand? Is this part of their spiel? A lot of time and energy and good work is being put towards diversity. I have to often remind those people that the diversity is a big D. That includes students on the autism spectrum, students with psychiatric disabilities. It's not just ethnic and racial. It's important. Practice, role play scripts may work. In my intro to college course that I taught for first semester students, we learned the language of college. Do you know what a syllabus is, or a registrar or bursar? That can be a cute little Jeopardy game. Practice effective email communication. Learn to write in a way that if you're writing to your professor and you want some time with the professor for some clarification, write a cogent email. Obviously, work on your own time management, organizational skills. And again, if there are resources through your adult human service agencies, some states, their DD agency also services people with autism. That was the case in Massachusetts. Voc Rehab exists in every state. They may have a role to play in terms of assistive technologies and evaluations and some support. Key takeaways, again, I'm being a little redundant here, but I'm a teacher. College capable, can they handle the academic demands? College ready, can they handle the independence? It's not a race to the finish. Can't tell you how many students I said to, 4 years is a number. Not many students don't do it in 4 years. That's okay. There's no shame in that. There's a great letter here. I'm not going to read it. You can read it on your own time, from Jane Jarrow. Jane Jarrow is an attorney that has worked in the field of disability for many, many, many years. It's an open letter to parents. She also is the parent of a child with disability. It's worth reading. And then there's several pages here of resources. A couple I'm just going to highlight here. LD Advisory, this one here, Elizabeth Hamlet. Her focus is learning disabilities, but there's a lot of overlap with her advice and her blog in terms of students on the autism spectrum. I've mentioned Dr. Eric Enlick, Top College Consultants, a wonderful resource. On his website is a listing of nationwide college models that provide support, fee-based support for students on the autism spectrum. So this whole thing here, very important. This is a cool group. I mentioned this is a group I was involved with. I'm on the editorial board of Stairway to STEM. It was a National Science Foundation grant. Unfortunately, the grant ended, but the resource is still there. It's a robust site with a lot of commentary, videos, interviews, podcasts. Most of the editorial board were individuals who identified as autism who were pursuing postgraduate work. And so I did some great work with them. So that's a wonderful site. I think that's how I was found. A few more resources. I talked about AHEAD, Association of Higher Ed and Disability, executive functioning coaching. This is another cool group, College Spy. There are now two that I'm involved with, Facebook groups open to families and professionals. One is the LD Advisory that's managed by Elizabeth Hamlet, and the other is the parents of college-bound students with learning disabilities, ADHD, and ASD. Professionals can join in. They can't really comment or promote their practices or their schools, but they can look at what parents are asking. And the National Association for College Admission Counseling is another great resource. I mentioned some podcasts, a couple that I did. I did one with Dr. Eric Enlick, Top College Consultants has one. I just, about 10 minutes before I hopped on, that Facebook group that I mentioned before, this one is running a workshop on January 25th on developing executive functioning skills, unlocking potential for students on the autism spectrum or with ADHD. Might be worth jumping in. I think it's free. Some more recommended reading. You know, you're going to get a reading list. The book I mentioned earlier, Jane Theophil Brown and Lorraine Wolfe. Jane Theophil Brown is from University of Connecticut. Lorraine Wolfe is from Boston University. And then there's a few more resources here that are great. Again, I'm not going to run through them all because it would take too long, but look at them in your leisure. And the other thing I would recommend is start looking or checking out with a student the college disability site. There's a great accessible learning one from Oregon State that gives you a good idea. A few tools that students might use. Goblin, you might be familiar with some of these. Assignment planner, audio note taker. Again, resources. My closing remarks, and I'm taking these directly from Laura DeGallo, adjunct professor at Central Connecticut University and a consultant to students with autism and mental health challenges. And that sometimes adults and parents supporting students may think that their intelligence will carry them through college, but they have to look at their soft skills, how well they organize, plan, get work done on time. Schools, parents, and outside professionals should work together to make a plan to teach students these skills. Says it all. Okay, I've been talking at you for now almost 40, an hour and 15 minutes. Brittany, can you share with me some of the questions, or I can pull up the chat?
I just want to remind everybody on the call as well, if you have questions, there are two ways. You can put those in the chat or in the Q&A, whichever works best for you. So Scarlett did ask, they understand that the 504 plan is not a documentation that's really used in college, but could it be used to receive additional counseling services at the university or the college?
That's gonna be a hard no. Sorry. So basically, that's not an accommodation. Counseling is not an accommodation. Fortunately, most college universities have a counseling office. I oversaw our counseling office. We had 2 licensed mental health counselors for a non-residential school. Counseling is available to all students. It's not, it doesn't replace a private therapist though, and it's not going to be an accommodation. Now, you may be assigned somebody in the disability office or the access office that has those skills that may do that, but it's never going to be considered an accommodation. It's available to all students. How much time you get, that's going to vary college to college. And what my experience was in our counseling office, we basically made it very clear that we were not in lieu of private counseling, but we were considered short-term brief counseling to help manage some specific issues that impacted the academic success. I hope that answered that question.
So the next is not necessarily a question, but more a comment from Sophia. The side-by-side of high school and college will be super helpful to clarify the transition process for our students and parents. Love the idea of learning the language of college. I will be trying this.
Yeah, and so the other group that I often talk to, I'm sure they have the same system in Illinois, is special ed PACs, parent advisory committees. When they meet, when they're active, it's great to have, a me or a somebody come talk, because that is really the audience. And then if the high school is providing some courses, some college preparation courses, definitely use those tools, steal them, pirate them, adjust them. I hope it's helpful. Thank you. Anything else, Brittany?
No, so we did have one question to us about CPDUs for this webinar. So we do not offer CPDUs, but we will provide you with a certificate of participation, and I will put the email address in the chat of who you need to email, and just let them know, or it'll go to our team. Give them the title of the webinar, the date, and your name, and we'll be sure to get you taken care of with a participation certificate. And then we did have one more question. Do you mind if we distribute your resource list to colleagues and prospective students?
Go at it. It's not copyrighted. No, and the thing I do with this is that I'm retired, but I do these professional development consultation, and I'm always mining new resources, trying to stay ahead. So definitely, and again, those 2 Facebook groups are very, very welcoming to families. So I would, highly advise you can hop on and you can request to join them. One is a little more LD focused, the other one's a little more ASD focused, but they have wonderful debates and questions and resources, and parents helping parents. And I'm going to say one more thing. I am available. So yes, I'm a retiree. I live in the woods in New Hampshire, and I do travel a bit, but not everybody likes to ask questions in public. I'm happy. My email address is there. My website is there. If you have a question or you think of something at 2 o'clock this morning, I won't answer at 2 o'clock, but I will get back to you. And if I don't know the answer, I'll try to hunt it down. I'm still very, very, very networked with a lot of the college university people. And if I can't find the answer, I'll try to. So that's all I've got. Anything else, Brittany?
Wonderful. So Susan, you have a lot of thank yous and how informative the presentation was, and really appreciating the information. Just a reminder for folks on the call, this is being recorded. So the recording and the slides will be posted to the ADA website, typically within 48 hours, just for us to be able to edit and upload everything. And then you will also be receiving a follow-up email with an evaluation and the link to the website. So please be sure to complete that evaluation, because it helps us kind of inform our upcoming professional development throughout the rest of the fiscal year. So Susan, thank you again so much. And thank you all for joining us on this chilly day in Illinois and being able to take time and make time for the presentation. We really appreciate it.
And I wanted on the recording to thanking Amy and Kirsten and Brittany for finding me, supporting me, and giving me this opportunity to at least, give some information and try to dispel some of the misconceptions, and hopefully address some of the anxiety around going to college. So I thank you for giving me this time.
Absolutely. And now that we know who you are and how to get a hold of you, we'll probably be reaching out a lot more.
That's okay.
All
Great.
right. Thank you all.
Stay
Have a great rest
warm.
of your day.
All right. Thank you.